Welcome again to our third session of Jamgön Mipham, his life and teachings. So, like I think I'm usually saying, I'm very glad you're here because I think knowledge of, you could say, the neighborhood in which we operate, the classics, and particularly then in the Nyingma and Kagyu traditions, some sense of who shapes the, you could say, the discourse and the particular ideas that permeate the practice and the culture of, you could say, the path that we are engaging with is significant. So it's just like, you could say, a lot of the arts, the writers and contributors to our culture, they very much shape, you could say, the way that we look at things. And so to have a grasp of someone as significant as Jamgön Mipham and his impact on what we're actually doing as practitioners of the path, I think is important. So I'm very happy you're here. So welcome to this. I just wanted to once again, like last time, just quote Dingwachin Rinpoche, where he says in in his autobiography, or rather you could say in the autobiographical section of what we have as Brilliant Moon, which is actually a collection of not just his autobiography, but also memories from his wife, daughter, and close students and other great lamas. Anyway, in Brilliant Moon then, Rinpoche writes, whenever I teach or study the Dharma, I still feel that the little understanding I have achieved is due to the kindness of Mipham Rinpoche, who was Manjushri in person. I have gained certainty about that. I pay homage to Manjushri, whose kindness led to my virtuous attitude. I also pay homage to the spiritual teachers, whose kindness made me progress. Just like these words of Shantideva, as soon as I was born, I met Manjushri in human form, and he took care of me without being asked, which could be considered the core of my life story. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you opened the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of courage, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. When we talk about these 8 minds of courage, the Tibetan is Sung, Dharani in Sanskrit. And it's difficult to translate because it covers a number of themes that really has to do with, you could say, the increase in intelligence, but also qualities that extend beyond intelligence in the sense of confidence, in the sense of mastery, in the sense of recollection of teachings, and essentially everything that enables us to have then what we could say certainty with regards to the path. So this is something that we very often associate with enlightened persons, this capacity of Dharani. And then incidentally also it refers to Sanskrit mantras. So, so Dharani has this sort of meaning, but here particularly then we talk about these qualities or aspects of this of courage or Dharani. So this chapter here surveys Mipham Rinpoche's works. And as you probably read then, in some editions, there was like 32. I think there was a recent Katok edition that had 32 volumes. I think I once heard about 35 volumes. Here then, at least 30 volumes, but there are various editions. Now, what I'm going to do in addition to Douglas Duckworth's overview, I'm also going to refer to existing translations. Douglas Duckworth does that some places in the footnotes, but anyway, and also, but there are also some that he leaves out. So and undoubtedly also in doing this, I'm sure I've left out things, and I have a few places in brackets inserted some things that Douglas doesn't include. But anyway, again, like I was saying before, these classics, they inform what we're doing. And for example, the first here, which we have two translations, the adornment of the middle way, which is literally what the Sanskrit and Tibetan means, which is umagyen, or Madhyamika Alamkara, which then also is translated as speech of delight. This is a very important text, really, in terms of our practice, because this is really the practice, or rather a text that significantly explains relative truth and also identifies the important aspects of absolute truth, which is of course what we're then engaging with in terms of our practice. Anyway, so there's going to be different themes then, and beginning with Madhyamika, then Mipham Rinpoche wrote this commentary, and some would say this is his finest work. There hadn't been any significant commentaries on this for a very long time, like Douglas Duckworth points out, really since the translation of Chandrakirti's Umala Jukpa, or the Madhyamika Alamkara, then really the interest in Shantarakshita's ornament of the middle way sort of diminished somewhat. It was somehow overshadowed, or what's it called? It was, yes, I guess you could say that, by Chandrakirti's work. And so it no longer was sort of the most important work on Madhyamika. But as we've seen, then Gyalpa Khyentse Wangpo was very keen on Mipham Rinpoche, you could say, bringing forth the heritage of the sutra teachings that came down from great Nyingma masters, the likes of Shantarakshita. And so he wrote this commentary, which is an incredibly an extraordinary work that combines, really, you could say, first of all, it fuses, really, finds a synthesis of two Madhyamika traditions, namely the Yogacarya and the Madhyamika. And we've looked at that earlier, but also incorporating pramana, reasoning. And those of you who've been following the Monday course will know that the Svatantrika Madhyamika, to which this particular teaching belongs, we're very keen on actually providing reasoning, where the Prasangika Madhyamika, much more hardcore, just on undermining any conceptual reference points and attachments. So that's where the Svatantrika Madhyamika really combines the Yogacarya and the Madhyamika, and does so seamlessly, really. And also, in fact, it arrives at the conclusion how the Madhyamika, as is presented in the ornament of the middle way, how that actually coincides perfectly with the Prasangika Madhyamika. So as such, the way that absolute truth is understood in the Svatantrika tradition and also in the Prasangika, according to Mipham, they're identical. The difference lies in the way that relative truth is explained, which in the Prasangika isn't really explained, but rather just simply left as ordinary people perceive relative truth. That's, for the Prasangika, that's fine. Whereas in the Svatantrika Madhyamika, there one actually makes, you could say, an educated guess at how does relative truth come to appear, and that's where the relative truth is explained according to the Yogacarya. So we have two really good translations, one by Thomas Doctor from the Dhammachakra translation committee, and then from the Padmatkara translation group, Speech of Delight and the Adornment of the Middle Way. And then another significant work on Madhyamika is then the Nobu Ketaka, the 9th chapter. This is Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on the 9th chapter of the Bodhicharya Avatara, the way of the Bodhisattva. And this, we say that that when Mipham Rinpoche received these teachings, he only received these teachings, the teachings on the way of the Bodhisattva, just for 5 days from Paltro Rinpoche. But as we have gotten to see, then he was an extraordinary, brilliant student, and on the basis of that had a very good understanding of what Paul Rinpoche was teaching, and hence also was able to write this significant work. And again here, bringing in the view of the ninth chapter, the view essentially of Madhyamika, but actually taking a different angle than had become prevalent, as we looked at last time. Then the Gelug tradition had very much become the dominant view, and you could say the Gelug tradition's view, if you like, that is very much emphasizes what we would call a non-affirmative negation, meaning simply that Buddha nature consists of this, that there's nothing that we can hold on to, that its very nature is simply lack of inherent existence. That's how we understand absolute truth. But from the point of view of Shantrakshita and many of what we call the early traditions, then it's not merely a non-affirmative. We don't understand absolute truth and the middle way, if you like, merely in terms of absence of inherent existence, but also as being endowed with all the qualities of enlightenment. So there's different ways in which this is understood. Some would say enlightenment is this absence of any inherent existence. And others would say, well, enlightenment is free from all the samsaric, confused, deluded phenomena, but it's endowed with all the qualities of enlightenment, enlightened qualities. And as such, you would have those that emphasizes this empty aspect, some that would emphasize this aspect of emptiness simply being empty of deluded phenomena, but not empty of enlightened phenomena. Mipham Rinpoche's point is rather that you can understand absolute truth conceptually, and there he would lean towards, you could say, the understanding of what we call then intrinsic emptiness or complete emptiness, nothing to be grasped as such. But at the same time, there is the understanding of the absolute which goes beyond any conceptual constructs. And in there you have, you could say, the whole phenomenology of awakened qualities. And so he would make a point that we refer to the absolute as something that cannot be understood conceptually. So anyway, as such then, his presentation of the ninth chapter in the middle way that's talked about in there is significantly different from the presentation of the Gelug tradition. And so there was two Gelug masters, someone called Pari Rapsel and another called Jakatuku, who wrote some critiques. And then Mipham Rinpoche again responded to that. And I think in one of the cases with Pari Rapsel, that actually became a very friendly exchange, and they sort of mutually ended up becoming very respectful of each other. In the Padmakara translation that you have on your right here, then you have these two rejoinders, the critiques and the rejoinders included in the translation. I just found, and I'm sorry I haven't mentioned here, it was just sort of as I was going through Googling Mipham Rinpoche's works in English, of which there's quite a lot. I found this translation by Gary Wiener, done together with the Venerable Gawang Rinpoche. So there's another translation as well. Anyway, this is a significant work in the genre of Madhyamika from Mipham Rinpoche. And then we also have, and oddly enough, then Dr. Duckworth doesn't mention that, but we have Introduction to the Middle Way, which is then Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on Chandrakirti's work, the Madhyamika, Madhyamika Avatara. Sorry, the Madhyamika Avatara. So we have this translation by the Padmakara translation group. I would say both in the case of the adornment of the middle way and the introduction to the middle way, you have a really good introduction by the translator. That's also quite significant for us who are approaching this material. So the Padmakara translators there, particularly then Helena Blankleder and Woolston Fletcher, written really good introductions to these works, these translations, and also, of course, in the wisdom chapter. This is also by them. Then here, Douglas Duckworth mentions another thing that I don't think exists in English, and it's something called difficult points of scriptures in general. So that is particularly includes then a refutation of this absolute truth as what we call a non-affirmative or non-implicative negation, where absolute truth is merely just, you could say, or not merely, but is understood in terms of just that the very nature of Buddha, the very nature of the absolute truth is that nothing possesses inherent existence. So there's some debate around this, and of course, in some way we could, yeah. So then we have famously the beacon of certainty, and sometimes people would say that this is something that Mipham Rinpoche wrote when he was very young. Some would then, I think Douglas Duckworth mentions that he's also understood as having written it when he was in his early 30s, but some actually say, oh yeah, he wrote this initially when he was just, I think, like 10 years old or something. And like Douglas Duckworth says, this kind of reflects how the tradition venerates Mipham Rinpoche. But he also supplies some information here that it was written when he was 31 years old, but also written, I think he said, within 3 weeks or something like that. It's an extraordinary work. And again, it touches on some of the points really where you can say, where Mipham Rinpoche probably says some misunderstandings that sort of snuck into the understanding of the middle way. So it essentially consists of someone asking 7 questions to a sage, and then the sage answering these questions. It's all a long poem, and then, especially in John Pettit's translation, then there is a translation of a commentary by I forget. I forget the name of the Kempo, but anyway, a student of Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche, and this is quite a significant work. And in terms of also, you can say, Mipham scholarship in the modern world, this was quite a pioneer work. Then there's also a teaching on the beacon by someone called Nyingma Rinpoche, who then actually presents it in a very friendly, user-friendly, easygoing way. John Pettit's is a more is basically just a translation plus a translation of the commentary, and is, you could say, not that it's a slightly more challenging reading, whereas Nyingma Rinpoche is sort of more, you could say, chatty, more accessible. So that's the journey to certainty. It's really just a sort of a friendly, user-friendly sort of overview of the content. So Douglas Duckworth, he says here in the beginning of the beacon of certainty, Mipham distinguishes an understanding that comes from genuine certainty from mere belief that comes from following what others have said. And this is significant. This is very much what Mipham Rinpoche is about, that there's certainty when we practice. Then it goes on to say, his emphasis on certainty reflects his commitment to analysis and self-reliance with regard to a firm grounding in personal experience, not simply relying on the dry words of another on one hand, and the Nyingma tradition, not simply relying on other traditions' interpretations on the other. So that we saw before, how some of the Nyingma traditions, they just ended up assimilating other traditions' ways of explaining things. Indeed, continues, certainty, or ngeshe, is a prominent theme in his works. In particular, he emphasizes a twofold certainty. One, a certainty in which you do not rely on something else, and two, a certainty that cannot be taken away by something else. So you have autonomy and you have certitude that cannot be, you could say, challenged, or rather you welcome challenge, but it doesn't bother you. That's where you say there's genuine certainty, not just like I don't want to hear about the others, but really just this sort of, like, you could say, fearlessness. And by the way, it's probably going to be mentioned elsewhere, Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche, he bases this fearlessness on 2 aspects. One is, you could say, the epistemic, the epistemology that validates the knowledge on the basis of, you'd say, various ways that we validate knowledge, just like we do it in science. And the other is an ontological perspective, or the ontological perspective of understanding reality, or in effect, what we talk about on one hand, pramana, on the other hand, madhyamika. And these two together, he said, they combined. They really, because one really asserts that the way that you arrived at your conclusion is based on sound, reasoning, and the other is a fearlessness with regards to what you see, what you understand. So one is, you could say, epistemology, the other is ontology, but as such they support each other, and it's said just like two lions whose neck are intertwined. Then you're sort of looking, you can see both sides, and you're fearless. So that's kind of certainty. Then also Mipham wrote some commentaries on what we call Jamgön Denga, or the 5 Dharmas of Maitreya. So here we have 5 texts, and I should actually have written all 5 texts, but I'm just mentioning the ones that Mipham commented on. There's 3 of these then, and one is then the Chödam Chöni Namche. And that's 2. We have 2 translations. One is from the Dhammachakra Translation Committee, and it's called Distinguishing Phenomena and Suchness. And this, by the way, also includes commentary by Khenpo Shenga. So they have both of these in the translation. And the other is Jim Scott's, which came out, I think, more like 15 or 20 years ago. And that's then the title of the same work is Maitreya's Distinguishing Phenomena and Pure Being. And that's basically, again, understanding what phenomena, how they appear to us, and then how they actually abide. This is a very important work then, basically also distinguishing between what we call mind and wisdom, and so on. Then there's another work which is called then Distinguishing the Middle and the Extremes, Uta Namche. And so there we have then again Dhammachakra Translation Committee, they've translated this as middle beyond extremes. And then finally we have 2 translations of what's called the Mahayana Sutralamkara, the Dodegyan, and that's translated as Ornament of the Great Vehicle Sutras, or that's by the Dhammachakra Translation Committee. And by Padmakara, there's a translation, A Feast of Nectar of the Supreme Vehicle. And these are both very large works. About these, then Douglas Duckworth says, structured around the process of an individual's engagement in the Great Vehicle, this text is an encyclopedic work that lays out the distinctive qualities of the path of a bodhisattva, such as the unique commitment and practice. While Mipham says that this text is a mind-only treatise, he emphasized that it can also be understood as a text on the Great Vehicle in general, compatible with the middle way. So, of course, this is a theme that runs through Mipham's, you could say, teachings, is really how the Yogacarya view, as much as it has sort of a lesser position in terms of the hierarchy of the philosophical views, the tenets. It's very, very helpful, and in no way stands in contradiction to the middle way. Also, Western scholars have identified this. The thing is, originally you had actually the middle way teachings from Nagarjuna, and the Yogacarya tradition coming down from Asanga came later. The thing is, the Yogacarya tradition was engaged more in, you could say, conversation, and also spoke more about, you could say, the phenomenology or the experiences, according to, you'd say, the confused condition, the enlightened condition, and the path. And so there's much more, you could say, explicit assertions about what we experience, whereas the middle way is more just about understanding how nothing doesn't have the reality it appears to have, and essentially it's about refuting any conceptual positions, which is of course very important, because otherwise in the Buddhist teaching we would just end up having philosophy. It's about taking us beyond philosophy. But meanwhile, having some inkling about where we're going and also being able to engage with others in discussion. And that was, you could say, part of the Yogacharya project, is very helpful as well. So these, they go well together. And like I was saying, Western scholarships actually identified this even quite a while ago, where it seems mainly the only person that, few at least, not so many Yogacharyans actually stuck to this thing that they often are sort of critiqued for. And that is this assertion of mind, what we call the dependent nature, as absolute, or as the reflexive awareness as being absolute. Not all Yogacharyas subscribe to that, and it seems maybe just a few did. Anyway, hence we have again this you could say marriage to some extent, or the compatibility between Yogacharya and Madhyamika. And then there's another important text from the 5 treasures of Maitreya, which is the what's called the Uttara Tantra, the Mahayana Uttara Tantra Shastra, the Sublime Continuum. It's translated in different ways. And the Tsongsaken Rinpoche some years ago has taught on this quite extensively, and it's published by Khyentse Foundation as what's simply just called Buddha Nature. Anyway, based on that, you can say the teachings on Buddha Nature, which has to do with the third turning of the wheel, emphasizes the luminosity aspect of emptiness, or Buddha, or what we call Buddha nature. Then Mipham wrote this text called Exposition of Buddha Nature. And in there he writes, all the phenomena of samsara are changing and unstable. While there appear to be transformations within the state of suchness of all this, it should be known, as was frequently taught, that the purity of mind, the Buddha nature, is without change, like space. In this way, the unconditioned expanse of luminous clarity is naturally pure and untainted by delusion. Within the self-radiance of the basic nature of the non-deluded, the qualities of fruition, such as the powers, they abide without separation, like sun and light rays. And he also says, or Douglas Duckworth then says, he contrasts his view with traditions that maintain Buddha nature as truly real and not empty, and that's the famous Jonang tradition from we saw earlier from Dragpa Sherab Gyaltsen, and the traditions that hold Buddha nature to be simply the mind's absence of true existence, and that's the Gelug, the view of Tsongkhapa, and the traditions that maintain that the cognitive quality of Buddha nature, the element that is in unity with emptiness, is impermanent, and that's a view we then have in the Sakya tradition. So in this way, you could say there's a richness really in the Tibetan tradition. It didn't just stagnate and become just everybody sort of more or less doing the same thing, but there was always sort of, you could say, discussions around these things. Of course, ultimately, when practitioners would engage in practice, they would have arrived at some certainty about the validity of practice, and then they could say everyone agreed that the nature of practice itself was beyond concepts. So it's really more about arriving at a place in which you are comfortable to then settle in without concepts. So there's different angles that you could say the different commentators would come at this from. And also, what's also significant, and also what really sort of accommodates you could say, justifies the presence of these different views, is that some would say that at various times, you could say misunderstandings had crept in. And so the different teachers, they emphasized particular approaches really in response to you could say, the demands or the needs for the practitioners to basically, you could say, reinvigorate or clarify the view in a way that would be helpful at that particular time. Then there's and so we have translations of then Mipham Rinpoche's exposition of Buddha nature. Let's just see here. He wrote this Lion Roar exposition of Buddha nature, and we have then English translations of these, 2 places really, in the back of this work here, Mipham on Buddha nature, and also in the back of this, which is a translation of Dilrukansurum, which is a biography of Jamgön Mipham. And so that's where you can find translations, two different translations, but also I think others have translated. I think Anne Burkhardt from University of Copenhagen in Denmark, she would have made a translations of this. And then there's another Lion's Roar teaching by Jamgön Mipham, which was referred to as Lion's Roar Affirming Otherness, Shintong Singing Aro. And I know the Nalanda Translation Committee have worked on that. I don't know if they published it, but I remember way back in the day that Scott Wellenbach spoke about how they were working on this text. Anyway, this text is then shows the way Mipham Rinpoche establishes other emptiness view. And this is the view that affirms the existence of the ultimate truth as not empty of its own essence. So that's where we would say, well, the ultimate nature, it's ungraspable, and yet it has all these qualities that they are for real. And of course, we can say, well, let's hope when we attain enlightenment that it's for real. But of course, what very often is emphasized is, yes, but it's not something that can be understood as something that can be objectified and grasped in the ordinary sense. So that would be the view of those who assert what we call intrinsic emptiness, but also those that would then say, well, there's a luminous quality that is, you could say, beyond time and space, and as such, it's permanent and real, and they would then be known as the other emptiness. And so there's that, you could say, that sort of a dialogue that takes place. Mipham Rinpoche also wrote then on the monastic vows, or actually not just monastic, but the vows of the Vinaya, and also what we call the three vows. What is interesting in Tibetan Buddhism is that we have actually this format in which what we call the vows of individual liberation, which is the Vinaya, that works perfectly well together with the vows of the Bodhisattvas. And that also accommodates perfectly the vows of the Vajrayana practitioners. Now you could say, if we look at it from the outside, the monastics, the Bodhisattvas, and the Tantric yogis, they could look as being very different in their style of practice. And of course, that's true, but it can also be combined. And the Tibetans had a lot of veneration for those that could combine all these three levels. For example, we can see in recent time, someone like the late Kyabje Chultse Rinpoche, who was a great Dzogchen master, but also a great Bodhisattva and a perfect monk. And we also see these in many other masters who are celibate monks, yet Bodhisattvas, yet great Tantric masters. So that's what we call the three vows. So Douglas Duckworth says, Mipham's works relating to the Vinaya include an interlinear commentary on the individual liberation sutra, Sotardo, Sosotabedo. Additionally, he composed an interlinear commentary on a text that discusses vows for lay people. So as far as I know, I don't think these have been translated. Mipham Rinpoche also wrote a short text on the three vows, the vows of individual liberation, the Bodhisattva vow, and the Tantric commitments, entitled Establishing the Three Vows as Essentially One. There's a mistake there. Shouldn't be Ngo Bok, but Ngo Wo Chiktu Drupa. Now this theme of the three vows is particularly famous. I don't think it's translated, but there is a very famous work by somebody called Ngari Panchen Pema Wangyal, which is studied a lot in the Nyingma tradition on the three vows. In English, we have a teaching, a writing, a treatise on the three vows translated into English by His Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche, and that's known as Perfect Conduct. So we have that, but that's not by Mipham Rinpoche. Then Abhidharma. So Douglas Duckworth says, Mipham wrote on the two main classics of Abhidharma that reached Tibet. We have the Treasury of Abhidharma, the Abhidharma Kosha, the Ngömpa Tse, And then we have the compendium of Abhidhamma by Asanga, the Nyingma Kundu, or the Abhidhamma Samuchaya. Sorry. Now the first, it's written by Vasubandhu before he was actually became a Mahayanist, and so this is written from the, I think, the Sautrantika perspective, basically what we would say this Hinayana view, and then the other one is written by Asanga, which is necessarily then a Mahayana text. Anyway, these two were actually brothers, and eventually Vasubandhu converted to the Mahayana. Then Mipham wrote, Mipham wrote on two main classics of Abhidhamma that reached Tibet: the Treasury Abhidhamma by Vasubandhu and Compendium of Abhidhamma by Asanga. I think we just read that, so forget about that. Another important work he composed on Abhidhamma is his popular Gateway to Scholarship, an encyclopedic textwork that draws from both Vasubandhu's and Asanga's presentations. The Gateway to Scholarship has come to be widely studied, not only in Nyingma institutions, but also in the Kaji and Sakya monasteries. Okay, I apologize. Actually, normally I put book titles in italics. So this one, it slipped here and there, I suspect. Anyway, with regards to this work, and this is called Kenjuk. There's another Kenjuk which was written by Sakya Pandita way back in the, I can't remember, 13th or 12th century. But this one here, this Kenjuk by Mipham, is then the one we're talking about. And there we have an English translation in 3 volumes by Eric Pemakunzan. So, and then with regards to pramana. Now, actually these days on Wednesday mornings here in Australia, then we are actually studying a pramana text by Jamgön Mipham, which we call Sword of Wisdom. But Dr. Duckworth doesn't actually mention that here. I should actually have included that. Strange. Anyway, he mentions that Mipham wrote commentaries on the compendium of valid cognition, the Tsema, what is it, Tsema Kuntu, and the commentary on valid cognition, the Tsema Namdrel. One is called the Pramana Samuchaya, and the other is called Pramana Vartika. So these 2 central texts by the main Buddhist scholars of valid cognition of India, namely Dignaga, who wrote the first, and Dharmakirti, who wrote the second. His commentary on Dharmakirti's influential commentary on valid cognition is more than 900 pages. So this is usually in the Shidras, this is the one where the kids they kind of go nuts. But some of the chapters and some of the argumentation and the logic is quite tough. But anyway, it's like sort of advanced math can be pretty tough. But of course, it all, once you get it, it really adds up. There's a what is it again? There's several stories of actually people, like I know Mipham had some hesitations, and he had a dream in which then he had a vision of Manjushri, I think, or Sakya Pandita, or not, yeah, maybe Sakya Pandita. Anyway, and also Khenpo Ngakchong was studying this, also had some difficulty, and then on the basis of their visions, then of course then they were able to understand it perfectly after that. Anyway, this is pramana. So we've covered some of the important Mahayana aspects, and then there's within Vajrayana, there's some very important commentaries that are studied very widely. And one is what's called the Kabye Namshe, the discourse on the 8 commands. And this is about the 8 sadhana sections, the 8 great sadhana sections. In the Nyingma tradition, we have you could say 8 great yidams that constitute what we call the Mahayoga sadhana section. You have the Mahayoga Tantra sections, which are the teachings on the peaceful and wrathful deities. And then you have the Mahayoga sadhana sections, which cover these 8 great deities, Yamantaka, Hayagriva, Vishuddhi Heruka, Sri Heruka, or Mahotra Heruka, and Vajrakilaya, and so forth. So that's one very important teaching that is widely studied. I don't know of any translation, even though I think that this would be one that definitely would be on the sort of important to translate list. And then there's one that has been translated, and that is his commentary on the Garland of Views, which is Padmasambhava's instruction on the 9 yanas. Apparently this comes from the Guyagarbha Tantra. I didn't realize that. But this we have in translation from the Padmakara Translation Committee, Garland of Views. And then we have an essential nature of luminous clarity, which is an overview of Longchenpa's great commentary on the Guyagarbha Tantra. And the Guyagarbha Tantra then belongs to this, what we call Mahayoga Tantra section. You could say this really provides within language, within a conceptual framework, an understanding of the purity of relative truth. And that's also where we can see the value of both the Abhidharma and the Yogacarya view of relative truth, because that is then what is integrated. You could say the vision of the Guyagarbha Tantra is essentially seeing relative truth without the ordinary dualistic fixation. But that's where the way that we understand our relative reality in terms of our skandhas, in terms of our the elements, as well as all the conscious experience, the ayatanas, all of that is established essentially in its intrinsic purity. And these are then the teachings on the what we call 100 and peaceful and wrathful deities. And this is the scope of the Guyagarbha Tantra, which is then, you could say, lays the foundation really of the Nyingma view that is that's basic to the what we call the inner tantras. So Longchenpa wrote a very great commentary on that called Dispelling the Darkness of the 10 Directions. And Mipham then condensed really the essence of what is said in there in this text that's known as, well, Douglas Duckworth refers to it as essential nature of the luminous clarity, Chidan Wosul Ningpo in Tibetan. Now there's two English translations. There's a luminous essence by the Dhammachakra Translation Committee. And then you have Essence of Clear Light, which is then translated by Lama Chönam and Sanjay Khandro. So I hope you're all noticing that I've pasted in the covers of these works. So I think you should be able to find them. Important point then on Mipham's integration of sutra and mantra. And this is very interesting because this is where you could say Douglas Duckworth juxtaposes Longchenpa and Mipham's, you could say, the difference in their emphasis on integrating these two, and particularly the great perfection. So Douglas Duckworth says, Mipham's main influence, Longchenpa, drew extensively from sutras to establish the legitimacy of the contested Nyingma Tantras in general, and the tradition of the great perfection in particular. And this is what we saw earlier, where we, for example, saw Rongzom. At the time of Rongzom Pandita, there had been this emergence of the new translations that were somehow suspicious of the validity of the Nyingma Tantras. And that's where Rongzom made a very powerful defense. And this is what we have then in some of Rongzom's works. But Mipham Longchenpa did a similar job. So he then drew from the sutras to really establish the legitimacy of the tantras and the great perfection. Mipham, he continues to say, also drew from sutras in his works, but it was apparently for a different reason than Longchenpa's. Longchenpa primarily focused his work on the great perfection and used sutras to support his view of the great perfection as legitimate expression of the meaning of Buddhist sutras. Mipham, in contrast, primarily focused on commentaries of sutra topics like the Middle Way and used the great perfection as the guiding principle of his interpretation. In other words, whereas Longchenpa directly elucidated the tradition of the great perfection and used sutras to support his claims, Mipham elucidated the great perfection within sutra itself. So that's where reading Mipham, we can see how the sutras are actually very, very valuable in terms and can be, the sutras are very valuable when we have the view of the great perfection. The sutras make make perfect sense, and we can understand the sutras from this view of the great perfection. He says a predominant feature of Mipham's commentarial style in general across sutra and tantra is his keen ability to interpret text through the lens of the great perfection. And this is also where you could say the sutras stand out with this, you could say, very empowering perspective of the great perfection view. He drew heavily from Longchenpa to articulate his uniquely Nyingma interpretation of Buddhist scriptures. So this is where we have this wonderful teaching of the Nyingma Tantras, the great perfection teachings and so on, and really to understand how these are the pinnacle of, you could say, the Buddhist path altogether is really, you could say, the project then that we're talking about here. It might sound as if we're sort of banging on about the Nyingma, the Nyingma view, and it could sound very sectarian, but it's really just to understand properly the context of Dzogchen and the relationship between Dzogchen and the general teachings that we have in the Buddhist teaching and how they actually fit together. And that's where this is what we're doing here, not like Nyingma for the sake of Nyingma as opposed to the others, but really just to really understand how Dzogchen fits in and how also the sutras, you could say, inform the Dzogchen view. So that's, you could say, the particular Nyingma project that is repeatedly referred to here. Now, then we have some commentaries on Longchenpa's writings, and a point sometimes that's made is that nobody would dare comment on Longchenpa's works, and apparently Mipham didn't comment a lot on Longchenpa's work either, but there's a few places he commented on the Yishinsu, or the wish-fulfilling treasury. So it says here, writing on chapter 12 of the wish-fulfilling treasury, he wrote on the ascension of views. Now, Douglas Duckworth makes a point of how the views, they are ascending. But in general, across the traditions, we come to a place where we would say, well, when it comes to the view of the Prajnaparamita, the view can be no higher, because the view of the Prajnaparamita is the freedom from any conceptual constructs. Like Sakyapantita says, if there's a view higher than the freedom from conceptual constructs, well, that necessarily becomes a construct. So, and you could say, well, important point, but what actually signifies the views of the Nyingma as being higher is the view on relative truth, which is then, you could say, increasingly subtle, and which then informs the skillful means of the path that you then have in the inner tantras. So that's where there is a continual ascension of views. The views become higher and higher, beyond even the Prajnaparamita view. Of course, they agree with the Prajnaparamita view, but nevertheless, in terms of understanding the manifest aspect, and also you could say the appearances and so on, then there is this, the views become even, you could say, greater, beyond the Prajnaparamita and up through the levels of the Tantras. Then writing on chapter 18, then Douglas Duckworth says he highlights a shift from an analytical approach of study to the embodied wisdom of meditation. In contrast to just the dry abstract analysis, the experiential dimension of meditative practice is central for Mipham. So we don't know exactly what the content is more specifically, but anyway, the point really is that Mipham continually was someone who was essentially pointing to practice, integration in terms of actual embodied wisdom of meditation. Douglas Duckworth says we can see that the tradition of Tantra or Vajrayana is particularly important for the Nyingma. In a fundamental way, Tantra discloses the practical application of the doctrine of Buddha nature, which is a key element in practice that bridges Sutra and Tantra. So this is, again, if you look at the various traditions, they will emphasize various ways of practicing. And so here then, very much in the Nyingma tradition, there is, right from the start, emphasis on the Vajrayana. Of course, in the modern context, there's even more than ever, you can say, need for the rational foundations of the Sutra view. But nevertheless, you could say the particular approach of the Nyingma very much is the emphasis of this integration of Buddha nature. Moreover, he then says, it embodies the common ground for Buddhas and sentient beings, samsara and nirvana. Indeed, Buddha nature, the great perfection, and the synthesis of Sutra and Tantra are all dominant themes in Mipham's works. Then there's some writings on the great perfection. There is, Douglas Duckworth refers to something called the Nyingma Korsum, the trilogy of innate mind. So these are instructions on view and practice in the great perfection. And it's something that he began, and there were students of his, for example, Shichen Gyaltsab, who then continued and completed this work, maybe also others. Douglas Duckworth refers to other students. And we have an English translation presently, just a translation of some of it, which I think is a collection of various refutations and so on. But it's actually, yeah, it's particular language of Jeffrey Hopkins. Some find it a bit difficult to get at. But on the other hand, the content itself, you can get a little bit sort of, you're okay with the language, then it's actually incredible writing. There's also some other other writings that Douglas Duckworth doesn't mention, and there would undoubtedly be many, many writings that you know, you just can't fit it in here. But we do have some other writings, which is then something called the Sanje Lakchang or Dampa Sanje Lakchang, which is then, you could say, could be translated holding the Buddha's hand. The Buddha holding our hand. And then there's also something called the Upadesha Rinpoche, the casket of Upadesha treasure. And I think this is more a collection that also contains some of the previous writings from the Sanje Lakchang, the holding the Buddha's hand. And some of these short little pith instructions have been translated into English. I've seen in Tatsama Tatang Tuku's works, then Crystal Mirror, then some of these have been translated, and also elsewhere. Mipham also wrote a text on the 8 Bodhisattvas, and so we have this work by Yeshe Gyatso, translated as a garland of jewels on the 8 Bodhisattvas. Then he also wrote on non-Nyingma topics, and there's a commentary on Chankhya Rinpoche Dorje's Song of the View, Tangur in Tibetan. And this has been translated into English by Karl Brunholz, and it's in a collection of profound instructions called Straight from the Heart. Then there's he also apparently wrote then a commentary on Tsongkhapas, the 3 principal aspects of the path, Lamki, Tso, Namsum. And then we have from him a commentary on Sakyapandita's Treasury of Reasoning, Semarikter. And then he wrote a massive 2-volume commentary on the Kalachakra Tantra. And then also, and I think this is where, you know, there's this famous story of what was it again? Paltrinbije, who was asked, you know, who's more learned, you or Mipham Rinpoche? Mipham Rinpoche was his student, but he was rather brilliant. And so Paltrinbije says, well, I think when it comes to the sutra teachings, I think we're more or less equally learned, but he does seem to be better. He does seem to have a greater understanding of the Tantra sections of the mantra teachings. So yes, so we also then have commentaries then on the Sarma deities such as Hevajra, Guya Samaj, the Chakra Samvara, and Vajragini. And then also Mipham Rinpoche wrote on Saraha's dohas, his songs. Saraha, who was this great Mahasiddha, and when we talk about the 84 Mahasiddhas, we generally would say Saraha is sort of, you know, the forefather or the head of all the 84 Mahasiddhas. So anyway, there's some very, very beautiful songs of realization, spontaneous songs that Saraha chanted, and which we have in writing. And then we have some commentaries. We have some commentaries from Mipham Rinpoche on these. We also have a translation actually of some of Saraha's dohas, various places, but one in particular we have from Herbert Günther. from the 1970s called The Royal Song of Saraha. Now then, Mipham wrote all sorts of interesting stuff, you know. And there's an 800-page, I think you probably read in there, the 800-page treatise on divination according to the burn systems, applying divination according to particular knots. You know, strings you tie with knots or rope with knots. Inconceivable. Anyway, we have that. Then we have, and this is where we only have, this is just a few things that are mentioned. Mipham, obviously, you know, in his 35 volumes would have written a lot on these devotional texts. There's a very famous text, short sadhana, or short practice really, of what we call Buddha Anusmriti, recollecting the Buddha. It's called the Treasury of Blessings. We practice this daily in Siddhartha's Intent online when we do the morning meditation. And these days I'm going to be teaching this in Melbourne. The next on Saturday and Sunday I'll be teaching this this text together with a commentary by Dilgo Kanzur. But Mipham, he based this writing actually on a direct vision of the Buddha, and he then proceeded to write a 1000-page commentary, the Gyapche Pemakabo, which is, you could say, the White Lotus commentary. Which is 1,000 pages on the Buddha's previous lives and so on. Very extensive. And then we have another White Lotus, but that's the White Lotus teaching on the 7-line supplication. There we have the English translation by the Padmakara Translation Group. And this is about how the 7-line supplication on the northwest border of the land of Uddiyana, which is chanted really in the Nyingma context at the beginning of any ritual or any liturgical practice. We always chant the 7-line supplication. And this teaching can be understood, this prayer can be understood in, say, outer, inner, and secret ways. So this is a commentary that Mipham also supposedly wrote when he was very young, and we had this in translation by the Padmakara Translation Group. Then other liturgies is that we have the shower of blessings, Guru Yoga, that also in Siddhartha's Intent we practice this on Guru Rinpoche and Dakini days. Then we also have Guru Yogas, just as mentioned here, but probably many more. Dharmakirti, Garab Dorje, and then also supplications and rituals related to Gesa, and also numerous other deities. Then miscellaneous. So he also wrote on secular matters. Famously then, like Douglas Duckworth mentions, the advice to the King of Dege. This is translated by Jose Cabezon on the Just King, written to the advice to the King of Dege, not the kind of Dege. Goodness gracious. Let's just see this. Anyway. King of Dege, he also wrote on medicine, astrology, divination, building, linguistics, poetry, painting, sculpture, martial arts, carpentry, knitting, jewelry, ink making, fireworks, and more. So famously, we know Mipham wrote this work on the Kama Sutra called Arts of Love. This has actually translated again by Jeff Hopkins. And also, sometimes the Tibetans would like to say, "Oh yeah, but he also invented the airplane of some sort, some flying machine of some sort." He also wrote a divination system based on invoking Manjushri. So we have an English translation that's by J. Goldberg, Mo, Tibetan divination system. So this used to be available. You'd buy this, and it would come with a little package with also included dice as ways that you could perform the divinations. Mipham was very big on Gesa. Many lamas have, but Mipham wrote quite extensively on this, and we also then have a translation by Robin Kornman. I think Robin died before he was finished with the work. I think the work was finished then by Lama Chonam and Sanjay Khandro. I might be wrong. They might all have worked together, but anyway, this was primarily, I think, a project of Robin Kornman. And I also forgot to mention also there's an opera written by Peter Lieberson about Gesa, if I'm not wrong. I think the The libretto was written by Douglas Pennick, and the music was written by Peter Lieberson. These are students of Jakob Tromba. And Tromba Rinpoche also was very big on Gesar, and Nyingma Rinpoche was also big on Gesar. Many lamas were big on Gesar. And to this day, actually, in Tibetan communities, you have these bards that actually channel songs of Gesar. And there are some who would say it actually at this point constitutes the world's largest epic. There's an enormous amount of writing about Gesar. Anyway, Gesar came from the kingdom of Ling, which is over in eastern Tibet, and a little bit difficult to sort of pinpoint the dates. But anyway, he was essentially, you could say, a bodhisattva. We say an emanation of Guru Rinpoche, and benefited beings in various ways. But there's very much recounted in terms of his heroic exploits as a great warrior. Of course, when we talk about warrior here, we're not talking about aggressive warfare significantly, but simply displaying the fearlessness of the bodhisattva. Anyway, that sort of fearless interaction with the phenomenal world on the basis of complete, you could say, realization of non-duality. So Douglas Duckworth writes, furthermore, he compiled and edited the popular Gesar epic, which had hitherto been mainly an oral tradition. The epic recounts the exploits of King Gesar, who is acknowledged to be an incarnation of Padmasambhava, in a classic tale that unfolds in a struggle of good versus evil. Mipham composed his own prayers and praises to Gesar, and he also arranged a theatrical dance depicting Gesar and his retinue, which continues to be a popular performance at Nyingma monasteries. So like I say, we have this English work on Gesar by Robin Corman, Lama Chönam, and Sadi Kandra. So, yeah. The epic of Gesar of Ling, Gesar's magical birth, early years, and coronation as king. And like I say, then we also have this opera by Peter Lieberson and Douglas Pennick. And then general, and this there's probably a lot more written on this, but significantly, a great work, really, very helpful in terms of understanding Mipham Rinpoche's view, you could say, writing, and his, you could say, the project overall is also by Douglas Duckworth. It's a work then called Mipham on Buddha Nature, the Ground of the Nyingma Tradition, and talks a lot, but in great depth and with a lot of quotes from the various writings of Mipham Rinpoche, how Mipham Rinpoche essentially understands themes like the two truths and the various forms of the middle way, the relationship between sutra and mantra teachings, and so on. And then we have Kama Punsol, Loban Kama Punsol from Bhutan, who is very learned. He's still with us, still a young man, I believe. And he wrote a brilliant book called Mipham's Dialectics and the Debates on Emptiness. And this is very much about, you would say, the discussions that emerged on the basis of the works I was referring to earlier, particularly the Nobu Ketaka, the 9th chapter, and you can see the views, the difference in the views, how they were represented in, say, the Gelug tradition, or in the by Tsongkhapa, and then in Mipham Rinpoche. So this is also very interesting book also. And then we have, if you go to lotsauerhouse.org, then you find a lot of different texts by Mipham Rinpoche on various themes, shorter texts, obviously, but also really well translated and so on, mainly by the likes of Adam Piercy and Sean Price and others. Yeah. I think that's it for today. I don't think I have much more. Is that kind of it? Yeah, that's right. So shorter session today, mainly about then Mipham Rinpoche's works. Now the next section, you might think it's the same thing, overview of Mipham's Buddhist works, but that's actually more treating the themes. So it's not going into the books, but really talking about, for example, next time we're going to talk about unity And that's essentially covering the topic of something we so often refer to, which is the unity of appearance and emptiness. So that's really just discussing this particular theme, which again is something that really runs as a red thread through all practice that we do, particularly Vajrayana practice, the unity of appearance and emptiness. All right, that's all for today. Gosh, it's rare that I finish before before usually I go overtime, right? So that's it for today. Any questions? Feel free. Is it necessary to read the heavy Abhidhamma works, such as that by Vasubandhu, in order to properly understand works on Yogacarya, Madhyamaka, etc.? No, it's not. And it's really, you could say these are written all in response to particular needs at a particular time. So of course, in the case of, you know, you could say in the case of those who study astrophysics, or those who study economy, or those who study physics and so on, you know, there you would have to have very substantial, if you want to change their views or enlighten them, you'd have to actually write very substantial works to really get their attention. Whereas for us, for whom these themes, you know, are fairly new, just to begin to sort of approach it already would be plenty for us actually. So, but to have just sort of an understanding that that suffices for us in order to just practice. And that's mainly to enable an understanding that takes us beyond the ordinary, you could say, belief and assumptions that we're stuck with. That would do it. So, so you know, the 900-page commentary on Dhammakirti's Pramanavartika, probably we can dispense with that, and you'll be happy to hear I don't think it's translated into English. But at the same time, some of the themes on the Yogacarya and the Madhyamaka is something that we continually come across. It's something that's, for example, very present in the present study on Mondays. It's something that's actually addressed very well in Douglas Duckworth's book, Mipham and the Ground of the Nyingma Tradition. And there are some scholarly works out there on the Yogacarya, definitely on the Madhyamaka, but what we essentially need to arrive at is some certainty in the view. So possibly some of the themes we're going to cover in the next few chapters will, I think, go a long way in order to achieve that objective. Okay, no more questions? All right. Thank you very much for joining me here tonight with this study. So shall see you next week. Thank you. By this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling, turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death, from this ocean of samsara, may I liberate beings. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all my lives, may I remain at your lotus feet, and study, reflect, and meditate on your texts again and again. Grant your blessings that I will hold, protect, and spread your teachings to the limits of space for as long as samsara lasts. Okay, thank you.